Hey everybody, welcome to this tutorial mini-series about how to get started using the Composition Framework. The Composition Framework is a graph and node-based visual editor that's great for things like sequencing events, cinema scenes, making user interfaces, dialogue trees, really any sort of game logic, simple or complex. It's pretty awesome. And I'm just going to show you guys how to create some simple graphs and interfaces in this series through a top-down maze-like game. Now I already have a sample scene set up. I'll just go through it real quick what I've done. I've imported our package, which you just need the two folders, composition and utilities. I've made two sprites, just a square and a circle for the player and the walls, and I have a player script that just takes input from the horizontal and vertical axes, the ones that are default in Unity, and adds them as a force to the rigid body on the player. And the player has a sprite renderer, a collider, a rigid body, and that player script, and all the walls just have a sprite and a collider on them. You can see if we play, move around this room, run into the walls. So we want to get out of this room, so let's make a door. And we'll just duplicate these objects. Doesn't have to be perfect. And I'll make this a different color just so we can see it better. So we want something to happen when we run into this door, and we can do that with an instruction graph. Now, an instruction graph is an asset, so you can use it across scenes and reuse it for different objects. So, for example, in a real big game, we would probably have dozens of different doors, other objects, and we can have them all reference the same graph, so you don't have to make multiple graphs for different objects, which is pretty cool. So, to make a graph, we're just going to right-click over here, go to Create. We'll make a folder and call it graphs. It's just best to keep all your different asset types in separate folders. So we go to Pyrosoft, graphs, and you can see all the different graphs types. You can make your own, but for now we're just going to stick with a simple graph. We're going to call it door graph, since it's a graph for a door. Now, we want to run this graph when the player runs into it. So we do that with what we call a graph trigger. And graph triggers are components that run graphs when various events occur. So in this case, we want something to happen when we run into it. So we're going to use what we call a collision graph trigger. So it happens to be there already, so we can add that. And basically, collision graph trigger just uses Unity's collision interface to run a graph when you either enter or exit a collider or a trigger. So we're going to select this enter, and we'll say door graph, which is the one we just made. And you can click on the little eye, and now we have the graph selected in the inspector. You can see that over here. And to edit the graph, click on the Open Editor button, and it'll bring up the instruction graph window. This is where you do all your editing of your graphs. It's pretty standard. You can move it around, pan it around, just like you would expect. Zoom in and out the mouse wheel, just like you would expect an editor. There's some other different options you can do up here, cut, copy, view all, that type of thing. So now you're probably wondering what a graph is actually. So a graph is a collection of nodes, and nodes act independently from each other, and they each perform kind of an individual specific function. And the graph itself connects them all together so that they run in a sequence with different branches and etc. There's tons of different node types. We'll constantly be adding more. You can create your own. Pretty powerful, simple to make. So to create a node, you can right click and click create, or you can just press space and it'll pop open the menu here. Here's all the different categories, or you can just search. The one that we're going to use, since we want this door to open, is called a transform node. So we'll create this transform node. And the first thing we're going to do, I guess I can dock this in a better place. You can really put it anywhere you want. I usually like to put it just down here next to the console, make it bigger. So we're going to name this transform node open door, since that's what it is. The name doesn't really matter. It's just good to name things what they're going to do, just to keep things organized. We'll make a connection to this node just by clicking on the little knobs. And you can see there's all sorts of different properties on this node. This will show up in the inspector when you click on it here. So there's all sorts of different properties. The one we're most concerned about first is this transform. So this is the actual transform that we're going to modify with this transform node. Now, when you run a graph, every graph is run with what we call a context object, and that object is the actual object that ran the graph. So in this case, it would be this wall, or this, well, we called it wall, we can call it door. This door game object. And so when you go and you click on the actual start node of this graph, you can see we have a context name. And this context name is how you will refer to the context object i.e. the door, through all the nodes in this graph. I'm going to call it door just because that makes better sense than context. So now if we go back to our transform node, in the transform property, we can say door, and boom, now we're referencing that object that was sent in. And there's a bunch of different properties here. You don't really have to worry about them too much now. You can just follow along. We're just going to shrink the scale down to 0 and do it over 2 seconds. And then when the door is finished, we're going to finish the opening, finish shrinking. We're going to create another node. We'll kind of call it destroy object. And we'll make a connection over to it. And we'll call this destroy door. And like we talked about before, the context object, this target, is door. And now when we run this, we can see there'll be green lines when this graph is running, and you can see kind of the flow of the graph. So we'll run up into this door, and as it's running, you can see, and then it destroyed. Perfect. You can see that it's gone from our hierarchy over here. So perfect, that's your first graph. Very simple, easy to set up. We can do tons more stuff, and we'll get to more of that in the future. If you have any other questions, please feel free to ask us on Discord. Look at our docs online. They're pretty robust. Go much further beyond this simple getting started tutorial. But we'll do some more complex stuff in the next video, so stay tuned. Thanks for watching.